or anything. So.
Okay, thank you, Meredith. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Brown, president of SAR, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program. This is the first of what we hope will be an ongoing series directed primarily to our alumni. As some of you know, last year we worked with a group of consultants to identify opportunities for the future of SAR. And one clear message that we heard from focus groups, and some of you may have participated in those focus groups, was that there's a desire among our former scholars and artists to connect with and learn from each other, both their sort of age mates from the year that they spent at SAR, but other scholars that they're acquainted with and are connected to SAR. So we welcome suggestions about future themes that we could work on together. You could reach out to me directly or to our Director of External Affairs, Meredith Schweitzer. Also on the Zoom call today are Paul Ryer, who's the head of our scholar program. Paul is waving his hand, and Sarah Solis, who's the director of SAR Press, and has done an extraordinary job during COVID of doing book talks, which is sort of an obvious thing that we hadn't done, and which she's really taken to the next level for our authors, some new books and revisiting some older works, looking at them, say, 15 or 20 years later. So that's been really a fun development of our programming during COVID. Let me introduce today's speakers, and then I'll just say a couple things about the format, which is pretty simple. Paul Stoller was SAR's 1992 NEH resident scholar and a contributor to several SAR publications. He's a professor of anthropology at Westchester University, the author of 14 books, which is kind of makes me weak in the knees. That's a lot of publishing, and it's great publishing.
I'm tired.
He's the winner of many awards, and I won't enumerate them all, but fairly recently, the AAA Anthropology in Media Award, that was in 2015. His recent books include The Sorcerer's Burden, the Ethnographic Saga of a Global Family, published in 2016 by Palgrave, and Adventures in Blogging, Anthropology and the Popular Media, 2018, University of Toronto Press. For a time, Paul blogged for Huffington Post and now maintains a blog called The Path to Wellbeing for Psychology Today. Also with us is Tanya Marie Luhrmann, who will be chairing a long postponed SAR short seminar, The Comparative Theory of Mind and Spiritual Experience. Tanya, thank you for your patience. I'm sure you understand why we haven't been doing seminars for the past 18 months, but we're hoping to get that rolling again in the fall. She's the Watkins University professor at Stanford in the anthropology department. She's known for ethnography on the streets of Chicago, homeless and psychotic women, worked with people who hear voices in Chennai, Accra, and the South Bay of California. She's done field work with evangelical Christians and Zoroastrians who set out to create a more mystical faith, and with people who practice magic. In recent years, she's written pieces for the New York Times in a series called The Big Ideas. Her most recent book is How God Became Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others, Princeton University Press last year. Also with us is Emily Sekine. She's the Cultural and Linguistics Development Editor for Sapiens, the Wintergren-funded anthropology website. She has a PhD in anthropology from the New School. And prior to joining the team at Sapiens, she worked with academic authors to help them craft successful journal articles and book manuscripts. She was the founder of Bird's Eye View Scholarly Editing. I don't know, maybe Emily can tell us if she's doing that. She probably doesn't have time to do that right now since she's got a full-time job. So the format is pretty straightforward. We're gonna open with Tanya. She's gonna take about 10 minutes to talk about things she's learned in her very successful effort to do more popular writing. Then I'll hand it off to Paul Stoller, who will do likewise. And then I'll probably ask a couple of questions to share among the group, especially with our featured speakers, and then we'll just open up to everybody's questions and have a conversation about it. If the traffic gets heavy, Meredith and I will try and keep that under control. Typically, these webinars don't go much. I mean, I shoot for an hour, but I suspect, given the topic and the very thoughtful people who are with us right now, we might go to 75 minutes. But at that point, I will probably bring it to a close, and perhaps it's a conversation we can carry on later under different circumstances. Anyway, Tanya, I'm doing a handoff to you. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hi, it's great to see everybody, and I'm so pleased to see so many people interested in writing for the public. I do want to say that I think that our greatest impact on the world is actually through our students, and I think it's really important to hold that in mind as a kind of moral commitment. But nevertheless, I think reaching out more broadly is really important. And I wanted to say a little bit about what I've learned by doing that. And just as background, I served for a time at the New York Times as a contributing op-ed columnist. I've written over 30 columns for them. I've done long-form journalism at Harper's, the American Scholar, Wilson Quarterly, and a number of other publications. I wrote 2 crossover books with Knopf, so books expected to be written to be read by both academics and by the broader public. And I'm writing a book that for Norton now that they hope will be read by many people. So what have I learned? I'm going to give you 5 principles that I find helpful, and then I'll walk through them. 1 is remember your audience. 2, write sentences that are true and detailed. 3, findings matter. Data matters. 4, tell a story. And 5, be an anthropologist. So let me say a little bit more about what I mean by that. What does it mean to be audience-oriented? When people begin writing for the public, often they think, well, I have something that other people ought to know. And that's true. But to reach across, you have to be thinking more in terms of what your audience wants to know. You need to think of yourself that the task is getting someone to turn the page, not something you usually have to think about when you're a scholar and your work is assigned to students who have to read it. So your job is to get people to write the kinds of sentences that keep people moving forward. One piece of editorial advice that I've been given is that you should think of having a hook, a turn, and a fall. So you want the hook is that you have to reach what your audience is interested in hearing, is captured by. You have to hook them into your work. And then you have to turn them to the story that you want to tell. And then they have to fall through your work without stumbling at any one sentence. So that brings me to the next topic, writing true and detailed sentences. That sounds simple-minded. It wasn't until I began to write for the New York Times that I realized how imprecise and vague most of my sentences were. What did I mean by many? What did I mean by recently? Last 20 years, last 3 years. So when you write for a place by the New York Times, you have a horde of young people whose job it is to read through your sentences in order to see how they could confuse other people and in order to see in what way they are not correct. Writing, so there are 2 things to say. You want to be as, you want any phrase in anthropology, is that a true statement about the nature of anthropology? Among Americans, is that a true statement about a claim that you're making in a sentence? So that you need to read those sentences with the idea that you might be not being truthful. You also want to say not the hotel room, but the drafty hotel room, not the dog, but the inquisitive dog. Those adjectives need to be correct, but good writing is detail rich. Good writing has, you can see what the writing is saying. When I write, I look at every sentence and I want to say, can the sentence be clearer, more vivid? Can it be shorter? Can it be more active? I find it helpful to read people like Anne Fadiman, who writes incredibly helpful sentences that are a kind of guide to your own. Findings matter. One of the most depressing things I discovered in writing for the New York Times is that it's hard to use modern anthropology as evidence because many modern anthropologists will say things, will see themselves as providing critique rather than information. The broader world wants new information. They want you not to say, in this chapter, I'm going to talk about. They want to know, in this chapter, I discovered that. So you want to, it's more complicated than you think, is not a story that you can sell to the broader public. I found out is a story that you can. One of the hardest things to do within the academy is to shift from I'm going to talk about to I found out. Psychologists do this well. Anthropologists tend not to do it so well. It's a real shift in mindset. Then you've got to tell a story. If you look at these magazines, which are sort of turn the page magazines, the New Yorker, the Harper's, the American Scholars, one of the things that you see is that they begin with a person. They begin with a particular human being who can carry the story through the intellectual argument you want to make. Malcolm Gladwell can present a story, he can make a story out of an intellectual argument. It's really hard. It's easier, and it's easier for people not familiar with your work and not assigned your work, but people you want to kind of capture into your story. It's easier to begin with a human, a living, breathing, complicated, detail-rich human whose story can carry the reader into the intellectual argument you want to make. And finally, kind of be an anthropologist. I remember talking to my editor, my first editor at Knopf, who said, so I was, how old? I was in my 30s. And the editor said to me, find your voice, read Janet Malcolm, which at the time seemed terribly sort of like complicated and paradoxical, but it was incredibly helpful. Janet Malcolm, whatever you think of what she writes, she has a very clear personal stance. She comes at the work with a way of looking at the world which enables a reader to want to read more. In developing your voice, your sense of who you are as a writer of this work, I think it is a mistake to try to be a journalist like all those gazillion journalists out there trying to write for a more popular audience. I think it is easier to come to your work as a certain kind of expert who spent years doing participant observation or whatever you've done, and to stand on that expertise as with a unique voice of an anthropologist who comes from that background in order to say something that can be read and understood by people who are sort of naive to the story that you're trying to tell. And they're naive because they're members of the general public. They have no reason to read your work. You have to explain what your authority is and trying to get them on board and to treat what you have to say as important. Finally, one of the best pieces of advice, well, I love Stephen King's book on writing. I think it's a very well written book, it's a very compelling book. One of the things he says that if you want to write well, you should read a lot and you should write a lot. That should just do it. There's something very powerful in that advice. I think it's helpful to have heroes. That is actually one of Harold Bloom's advice. Have a hero, identify with a hero, and as you write, you will become your own voice. For me, that hero is E.B. White, one of the great essayists in the American tradition. Also the author of Charlotte's Web, but that's a little different. He wrote brilliantly about being in Maine, living through a war, struggling with death. And I just find that his sentences are clean and clear and limpid, and they help me to think. So before I write, I will read somebody whose work inspires me and whose sentences will ring in my mind, so that when I write sentences, they will be as clear and as accurate as they can be. And then I revise. I think Susan Sontag actually underestimated. I think you need more than 17 drafts before you publish. I think that's just the way the world works. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Paul, I think.
Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. I see some familiar faces in the crowd, and I want to start out by talking about something which is unfortunately a common truism, and that is that we live in troubled times. And just last week, there was a manifesto published in Anthropology News. It's called the Collaborative Manifesto for Anthropological Change, July 14th. And there were 5 political anthropologists who were writing about what needs to be done from their perspective in our discipline. And they advocated for things like progressive social change, refined techniques for studying institutions. They said we need to engage in more collaborative, multi-sided anthropology. They said we should promote more intellectual dissidence. And they said that we should use the anthropological imagination against the long history of capitalism, the culture of mastery, which has brought on a perfect storm of crises that threaten human viability. And so, I read this, and I felt this is terrific that this is being published in Anthropology News, and these folks thought it was, important to bring up this issue in these troubled times that we live. However, there was, one thing I would add to that list, and that is the importance of communicating those findings based on these recalibrated methods and priorities to the public. They don't really mention writing in any of this collaborative manifesto. So for me, I've done a lot of field work, and I'm continuing to do field work in New York City with adjustments for the pandemic. And I've done a good bit of writing. And one of the things about the writing that I've done, and it's in all of the things that I've produced, and that is I've foregrounded narrative in my writing. And I firmly believe that narrative is a profound way to connect the reader to the the writer to the reader. And there's something about narrative that sticks with us, right? I mean, if you think about all of the conferences that you go to and listen to all the papers at, say, a AAA meeting, how many of them do you remember? I just remember a handful myself, and those were ones that the speaker was telling a story, even better if it was a humorous story. So, so I think that, I've always tried to foreground narrative and use narrative as a way of talking about theoretical anthropological issues. And the goal of my writing has been the attempt to create a text in which the reader connects with the people and the place, and ultimately connects with the knowledge of these people and the wisdom of these people, right? So, and for me, what's important is I get from the Songhay people of Niger and West Africa, and that is their theory of learning, and that sort of situates my what I want to say here today, and that is that young specialists among the Songhay, they learn the nuts and bolts of a practice, whether they're a weaver, whether they're a fisher, they fish, whether they are a bard, or whether they are a sorcerer. They learn the nuts and bolts, and they pass many tests. And by the time they're middle-aged, they're ready to practice what they have learned. So it's a long apprenticeship. However, when one reaches the status of an elder, they continue to practice what they learn, but their greatest obligation is to pass on what they have learned to the next generation, right? So in my orientation, I've learned a lot about anthropology and a lot about ethnographic writing, and I've put all that energy into teaching ethnographic writing in courses and or workshops, right? And the effort is to produce texts that have less telling and more showing, right? So in other words, less denotation and more evocation. So, our training, the academic training, we have sort of what I call academic shackles, a long history of, what I call bloodless prose, of the bloodless prose of plain style, which is deemed scientific. And, we're all sort of want to produce this kind of, if we've been trained as anthropologists, we want to reproduce this kind of thing because there are obviously institutional awards. These are our institutional expectations. So one of the first things I do in my writing workshop courses is we do an exercise. And I pass out a sheet of paper with some really bad academic writing. So I pick, may he rest in peace, I pick Pierre Bourdieu, and you can go to any page of Pierre Bourdieu, open it up and find bad academic writing. Dense, turgid, full of jargon. And I say, okay, take this piece of writing and see if you can transform, first of all, see if you can figure out what he means by it. And then secondly, see if you can transform it into something that would, that an average person might understand. He's obviously making some important points. So see if you can transform it into something that this person would be able to understand. And usually, so people, in the workshops, people will do, they'll come up with some things, they'll take some time to come up. And sometimes they produce, they sort of try to reproduce Bourdieu in a simpler language, and sometimes they come up with some very creative responses, dialogues, plays, et cetera, et cetera. So, but what that does is that it sort of shakes loose, it sort of shakes people up a little bit and demonstrates the possibility of presenting complex information or complex theories in a different mode, right? So that's sort of like the beginning exercise that I do in my course. And then we focus on three dimensions of producing writing narrative. One is evoking space and place. One of the the key things, one of the great gifts of ethnography is it gives the reader a sense of a place, right? So how do you evoke space and place? You do it through an exploration of the senses of a place, right? So what is a place? What are the sounds that you hear in a place? What are the smells? Obviously what are the visions, et cetera, et cetera. And in so doing, I tell them so I ask them, pick a place that you want to describe. Maybe it's from your fieldwork. Maybe it's a street, maybe it's a building, and think of that place as if it is alive, filled with sentiment, filled with memory, and use that sort of foundation to explore how you're going to describe this place, right? So that's one exercise, and we get some fantastic evocations of place, in the workshops that I've been doing for more than 10 years. And I also ask them to read a number of people writers that really have a fantastic capacity to evoke space. One is James Agee, Now Let Us Praise Famous Men, which is filled with evocation of space in Southern Alabama in the 1930s. You can almost feel the places where the sharecroppers live. My friend Anna Bodkin, who is a creative nonfiction writer, who writes beautifully about West Africa and also Afghanistan. You get a sense of what it's like to be there and in Afghanistan and also in Mali and Senegal. One of the greatest anthropologists who writes about space is Piers Vitebsky, who writes about Siberia and the reindeer people in his book. And he has descriptions of Siberian space that just are breathtaking, absolutely magnificent. Another person who evokes space in a magnificent way is Ruth Behar. And then finally, Michael Jackson. So I asked them to read and look at the techniques that these writers use and use them as a model for your own sort of exploration of space and place. Then we talk about dialogue, all right? And in most anthropological writing, dialogue, it doesn't really exist very much. You have blocks of quotations, and I find that producing dialogue in a text it sort of brings the text to life, right? So the dialogue is very, very difficult to write. It's very difficult to get right. So it takes a lot of practice. So I give them some examples of great dialogue writers in literature. So some of the best are mystery writers like Elmo Leonard, who writes, Get Shorty Guy. He writes fantastic dialogue. Walter Mosley, another one, Easy Rollins, writes magnificent dialogue. And there's a creative nonfiction writer named Joshua Hammer, who wrote a book called The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, who has fantastic dialogue in that text. So it's just using them as a model and looking as a way of using them as a model to proceed on your own construction of dialogue. And I find that the students that have been in my workshops and courses have struggled really with dialogue because it takes a lot of practice. But if you get the sonorities of sound of a person's their idiosyncratic expressions down, it sort of jumps off the page after a while. And so that is a way to get the reader to turn. All of this goes back to what Tanya was talking about earlier, and that is the challenge of writing is to get the reader to turn the page, right? To pay attention to and to connect with the reader. Then finally, there is character, idiosyncrasies of character. So what is it about a person that makes them different? Is it the way they walk? Is it a particular expression they use? Is it, is their face set in a certain grimace, or is it a smile? Is it a grin? Is their shoulder set to one side or not? What's their posture like? What is it about them that makes them different from everybody else? And so this may have to do with dialogue. It may have to do with physical description. And some, again, fiction writers are very, very good at this kind of thing. One of my favorites is Michael Chabon, who's written many, many books. And, he has the art of describing character in rather economical prose. He has it down very, very well. My friend Anna Bodkin also is in her book called Walking with Abel, which is about the Fulani nomads in Mali, has a beautiful way of describing character as well, through physical description, through evocation of the expressions, et cetera, et cetera. So those are our what we do. We also faced with the crisis that I mentioned before, it creates some people have suggested we live in a kind of climate emergency. If you read, there's a fabulous book by Tim Morton and Dominique Boyer called Hyposubjects on Becoming Human. And they talk about this kind of thing in a rather wonderful way. So if we're in this situation, maybe it's, maybe we need to take certain expository risks. My mentor, Jean Rouch, confronted with colonial violence and racism in the late in the 1950s, risked inventing a new genre of film called ethnofiction, right? And one of my favorite philosophers, Nietzsche, said, in a world in which nothing seems to make sense, he says, in a world in which logic curls its tail up and bites its own tail, he said, there is the remedy of art. And for me, the art of ethnography is a powerful way to put forward our insights, to promote the wisdom of, and I think it's very important in these times, to promote the wisdom of indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdom. So, these exercises are ways of getting people to break out of their habits. And in my experience with my course and my workshops, I found that people find the experience kind of liberating, and they've gone on to produce, write books, create short stories, creative nonfiction pieces that are quite creative and reach a large audience. So it's been a very inspirational kind of experience for me, and I've learned an awful lot from the students, the participants in my workshops, and hopefully, they have been compelled to write for a larger audience. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I turn to Emily Sekine, I just wanted to say, I was thinking about your Bourdieu example, Paul, and one of the most famous takedowns in sociology was C. Wright Mills' takedown of Talcott Parsons in the Sociological Imagination. And I guess Wright was, Mills was like one of the bad boys of sociology of his period, and Talcott Parsons, who everybody's forgotten, was this gray eminence at Harvard and the top dog of his day. Mills takes paragraphs, like 500-word paragraphs by Talcott Parsons, and then translates the 500 words of leaden prose into things like "people would rather be liked than disliked." It's really compelling, and he's absolutely spot on too. But Emily, I'm sure you prepared some comments, but before you launch into that, I just wondered, what both Tanya and Paul have talked about is how we have to, well, first of all, the audience issue. The audience when we're graduate students is your committee, basically, and in a broader sense, a little bit vaguer at that stage of our careers, your profession. And yet, to turn the corners that Tanya Luhrmann and Paul Stoller and others have done, you have to kind of throw that out the window and think of a completely different audience. So how do you convince? You must see dozens or hundreds of articles that come across your desk. How do you help your writers turn the corner and really rethink their audience, and in that way rethink the way they write?
Sorry, go ahead.
Go
ahead.
on.
No, go.
Oh, Michael, were you asking us, or were you?
Well, I was asking Emily.
Okay, no, Emily, go ahead.
She's in the editing business these days.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to talk about that a bit more in my comments. But yeah, I think exactly it's about kind of turning what is a topic into a story. So figuring out, not just I'm writing about X, but I'm writing about X and it's interesting because of Y. So really, you kind of need both of those elements. And I think people often get stuck on one or the other. Like either they can tell you why something's interesting, but they can't actually tell you the necessary context that you need to really understand it as a general reader, or they have that topic, but they can't convey what is interesting about it to a general reader. So I think it's kind of figuring out how to bring both of those pieces together is how I sort of see a lot of my work playing out.
Any other issues that you wanted to mention, or problems that you've helped writers to resolve when you're looking at their work?
Oh, so many. Yeah, do you want me to just maybe start to kind of go through my comments? Because I do get
Sure, yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much for organizing this. And thanks so much for the really interesting thoughts from Tanya and Paul already. So since I am, in this kind of editorial position, I'm here kind of primarily in that seat as the editor, as an editor at Sapiens. I think most of you probably know a bit about us, but just in case, we're a digital anthropology magazine that was founded by the Wintergren in 2016, and we're now published in partnership with University of Chicago Press. We are editorially independent and dedicated to all things anthropology. We typically publish an average of 3 original pieces per week. And those are a combination of pieces written by anthropologists from the 4 fields, and pieces sometimes written by journalists who are typically science journalists reporting on things happening in anthropology. Most of our essays are between 1,000 and 2,000 words, so they're pretty short. We also publish poetry, photo essays, reviews, and as we're kind of moving forward and rethinking things, we are also really interested in publishing more multimedia and kind of experimental storytelling genres as well. So a lot of our essays in the past have been kind of more science journalist in their kind of approach and the format. So we are kind of thinking about other ways that we can really take ethnographic writing and make it into a form that is, accessible and interesting to the public. So my role as developmental editor is to work directly with anthropologists from the initial pitch stage to the final publication of their article. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about kind of how I became interested in public anthropology, and then some of the challenges that come up and things that I try to do to help writers kind of get their piece into shape. So for my PhD research, I was looking at post-Fukushima Japan and how people were dealing with the constant kind of uncertainty of living alongside unruly geological processes like earthquakes and volcanoes. And I loved doing research, but by the time I graduated, knew that I didn't want to do an academic career path. It just wasn't a good fit for me. And part of that was because I felt very limited by the academic writing genres and the kind of what was expected. But, I loved writing and storytelling. And so that's something that I have continued to pursue with my own writing, like trying to figure out other forms of narrative nonfiction that are still very ethnographically informed and deeply researched, but that don't necessarily fall into that academic writing style. And then as an editor at Sapiens, I think I've actually kind of learned to value anthropology more as I've taken a bit of distance from it. It's like absence makes the heart grow fonder sort of thing, where I really see the value of all sorts of anthropological insights, even fields that, maybe I personally wasn't engaged with that much when I was doing my graduate studies. But just the combo of having, closely observed ethnographic insight with rigorous analysis and conceptual work that can actually help people think differently, help people, revise their assumptions about how the world works. It's just, everyone here knows that, but it's just incredibly valuable. So, any way that I can kind of help as an editor, I'm kind of the intermediary between what the anthropologist wants to say, what the reader wants to listen to, or what they might need to kind of get engaged and to kind of get on the same page. So I'm like the translator in between is how I kind of see my work. So one of the challenges that I have come across a lot is that I think anthropologists don't think of themselves as writers. They think of writing as something that they do a lot. It's something that is really obviously takes up a ton of their time. It's something they spend a lot of effort on and energy on, but they have, a very fraught relationship with it. Even people who enjoy it, I think, often struggle a lot. So that's also a big part of my job is kind of helping people face those those, whatever fears and anxieties that they have around writing, and trying to kind of help them let go of some of those constraints that maybe they are stuck on or that they feel really committed to, especially I would say maybe early career scholars who, really feel that they need to be writing in a certain way, and are very aware of kind of potential landmines when you're writing. Like one of my colleagues, I remember saying she felt like writing in an academic way felt like you're just walking through a field with landmines, where if you kind of use the wrong word, you accidentally set off, a bomb. And so kind of getting people to let go of some of those fears a little bit is a big part of what my role is. But on a kind of more practical level, I think a lot of people think about public writing as just being about communicating what their work is about in an accessible way. And so a lot of the focus tends to be on like sentence level language issues. So they know they need to avoid jargon. They know they need to write concisely. They know they can't make their sentences too complex or too long. And so I think that people think about it on that level, but they're not often thinking really about how to craft a compelling story as a whole. And in terms of like some of those literary elements that Paul was talking about, that I think can be really fun, potentially, to play with. So, things like using metaphor, using vivid imagery, maybe using personification or hyperbole, or even humor. Humor is something that I would love to see more of, but you just really don't see it done very often. Playing with tone and perspective. So, thinking really about you as a narrator and, what kind of a narrator do you want to be? Are you a reliable narrator? Tanya suggested like really presenting yourself as an expert. And I think that is generally like the way to go, but, there could be times when that's not what you want to convey. Maybe the piece of writing that you are working on, is really about not presenting yourself as an expert, but presenting yourself as someone who's doesn't know anything. It depends on kind of what your purpose is and what you're trying to elicit from your audience. So, thinking a lot about that, like how do you want them to feel angry? Do you want them to be curious? Do you want them to feel called to action? Just what's kind of the goal in terms of the emotional reaction that you want them to have. And then the big thing that I think a lot about is plot. So, really thinking about the sequencing of events and the pacing of your narrative. So how can you kind of build in elements of suspense or build in tension, things that will make readers want to keep reading, like both Tanya and Paul were talking about. Sometimes that's, not giving away the whole point right away. It might be like hinting at it in some way, or, telling a story where you like you don't kind of explain what the story means until a little bit later in the piece, just kind of building in those moments of foreshadowing or, suspense that will kind of string the reader along. Honestly, you want them to kind of be pulled along in some way and to get from point A to point B in a way that is fun for them or interesting for them. So one thing I just I'll sum up here, but one thing I wanted to mention that I like to do in my own writing is storyboarding. So I use like this technique, that filmmakers use. And this is like an actual poorly drawn storyboard that I created in a creative nonfiction class at one time for an essay that I wrote that ended up being published in Orion magazine last year. And it's just a really generative exercise because it helps you to really think about how much descriptive detail that you need to include. Sometimes people over-include detail that really isn't that relevant to the actual story. And that would be, akin to like a really zoomed in shot on something that really had no point in the larger film. So I think about the other literary way that people talk about this is the distinction between scenes and summary. So a scene is like that close-up shot where you're really zooming in on the action, you're giving a play-by-play, you're including things like dialogue, vivid details. And it's really, you know, a sense of immediacy, like you're being dropped into an actual scene. And then summary are those parts in the text where you're like zoomed out, you're maybe giving, you know, a view of a building or a city street, or even like an aerial view with a voiceover, you know, narration coming down and really telling you big picture what's going on. And so, you know, in an essay that would be like, you need to zoom out here, you need to give us that big picture of whatever this historical event is that, you know, you need to understand to understand what this scene is about, or you need to set up what this social trend is or what this phenomenon is that's going on. So, you know, a dynamic story should ideally have a mix of those. It's not like you're always zoomed in or you're always zoomed out. It should be kind of like playing with those both. And I think often just when people are thinking about their fieldwork, there are these kind of scenes that are already there in your mind, right? There are moments in your fieldwork that are especially vivid to you, and often those are moments where there was actual tension or actual turning point in your understanding of a situation. And so often it's just kind of mining those things that already exist and really figuring out a way to like write that as a scene. I think that's often just, yeah, a helpful exercise. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Sarah Solis, since you work with book-length manuscripts, is there anything that you'd like to add to that, or a different wrinkle that you'd like to call attention to?
Well, I think what everyone said has been amazing and right on. I think that this was just a ton of good advice. I think something we talked about a little bit when we were preparing for this event was, well, and I think Emily touched on this, the sort of so what question, which is something I ask people a lot, and just really trying to emphasize, I guess you were talking about this, Emily, with the tension between your topic and your sort of significance or context. But just really trying to emphasize, you know, you have this thing that you're interested in, but who cares? You know, you have to make us care. You have to sort of do that work. It's not, you know, the work that your audience is going to do for you. So I think I would just add that. And I, you know, especially even if you're thinking about not your manuscript necessarily, but a proposal for your manuscript, I think it's maybe even more important that you bring that out. But otherwise, I've loved listening to everyone. This has been fascinating and really useful, I think.
Let me ask a question to the group, and then we'll just open it up to everybody. I mean, most of you focused on the importance of detail, bringing as much detail, evoking place, smell, sound, etc. But I don't know, more recently, I've found myself drawn to writers who leave stuff out or who create spaces in the writing. And that's not inconsistent with Emily Sekinet's comment about creating suspense. I mean, an example for me, you know, Tanya mentioned having heroes and writer heroes. And one of mine is James Salter, who is a writer of fiction, went to West Point, flew a fighter jet, and he wrote one of the most amazing memoirs I've ever read called Burning the Days. But one of the things that's interesting about it is you hear about his whole life or many parts of his life, but he never actually explains to you his marriage, his partner. Clearly it's intimated that he had a child who died under tragic circumstances, but he doesn't really go into that. And there's just something slightly haunting about that in a way that I'd never thought about before. I mean, and I wondered what our writers think about that, or am I just barking up the wrong tree on this?
I don't think you are. But, you know, the great writer Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote about his craft, and one of the things he wrote about description was how important it is to leave details out and leave, you know, just put in enough, you know, vivid details and leave the rest to the reader's imagination. And it's a way of compelling them to, you know, go on and bring them into the text. So it's really very important to know what to leave out. Very, very important.
I'd agree with that. One of the one of the great writers says something like, you only include the details that matter. And so, you know, you don't say everything. I do think that one of the hardest things to do when you move from writing for an academic audience to writing for a public audience is to remember that it helps for readers to see what you're talking about. And that is a big shift between moving from, you know, books published by Duke University Press to the novelists that you like to read. And you're not, nobody in this group is probably writing a novel, but writing well for an audience that wants to turn the page involves some of those skills. And so I'm totally with you, but you also want your reader to be there.
Yeah, I agree as well about leaving some spaces or emptiness. That's also like very key Japanese aesthetic idea that the emptiness is as important as the content. So I would just add, I think what some people are doing with flash ethnography is a really interesting development within the field. There was an issue by American ethnologists that collected a bunch of these really short pieces. I think they're under 750 words. And that's like, you know, a real challenge where you're really having to choose every single adjective, every single verb. But yeah, I totally agree. I think it's not just excessive detail for the sake of it. It's necessary detail.
Why don't we open this up to questions from other participants? I'm happy to hear what you have to say or questions that you may have for our experts.
I have a question. So far, this has been great. So far, I've heard an awful lot of everything's been about writing. I'm interested in how you get the outlets, because we know how, at least if you're at my career stage, you know how to get published in a professional journal, the scientific journal, or whatever you want to call it. I'm very interdisciplinary, not just anthropology. I have two specific questions. One is, how do you get a blog or a column in the New York Times? The other one is, how many readers does Sapiens reach? And what proportion of them are in anthropology versus the general public? So the first question is more for Tanya because she has the blog in the New York Times, and the second question is more for Emily.
So with the New York Times, I wrote this book, When God Talks Back, and I ended up, and the New York Times really liked it. It was one of their books of the year, whatever it was. And that happened to coincide with the time when they were changing the structure of the Sunday Review to include fewer political voices. One of the things that's helpful to reflect on is that there are an awful lot of people writing about politics. And so it's sometimes can be helpful not to be one of those many voices. And then, so they invited me to write, and I had submitted a column. I had advice from my editor that said, so I wrote 20 columns when God Talks Back came out, and I just tried to place them. So I just sent them around. There's a way to do that. You know, you look at where you send them, and you know, you look up the Washington Post as a place to send them. You just kind of send them in. CNN, place to send them in. It's great if there's somebody who will help you, but you just send them in. Getting rejected is a big part of this process. And then so I did one for the Times. Then 6 months later, I did another one. That's when the Sunday Review changed. So somebody said to me, why don't you try a few more? One of the things that's super helpful to remember when you write for the public world is that in the academy, time is irrelevant. In the university, in the newspaper world, if they say Thursday, they mean Thursday. And you better keep the Thursday. It doesn't matter what you're doing on Wednesday. And And so, and then, you know, when I stopped, it was because the editor changed, the election happened, politics mattered in a new way, Sunday Review changed. So there's a lot of happenstance, but being prepared, luck favors the person with a lot of pieces to place. And so it's helpful to just try.
What was your book, a popular book, the one that caught the Times' attention?
It's what's called a crossover book. So it was expected to serve my interests as an anthropologist, to make an anthropological argument that would please my peers or engage or enrage my peers, depending on your point of view. But it was also intended to reach what I would call the New Yorker audience. So it wasn't as successful as, you know, Jill Lepore has a very, very large New Yorker audience, but it's not my audience. Historians often have a much larger audience than anthropologists, but the usual, you know, so it had many more readers than some books do. I should say a lot of this is unpredictable.
Yeah.
There are, I mean, Philippe Bourgois, I think, has sold over 50,000 copies of his first book. I have not done that. His first book was with, I don't know, you know, Princeton, California, maybe. I don't think he expected that. Fashion is real. It's hard to predict fashion. Your job is to be prepared and to do the best you can, and then to see what opportunities might present themselves to you. But you have to keep trying.
Thank you. That's great. And Emily, can you answer the questions about Sapiens?
Yeah, so in terms of readership, we have around 100,000 followers across social media. And I know that last year we had around 4 million page views, which just means unique views of the site. So it's a little hard to kind of estimate how many of those are, how many readers those are, but it's a pretty wide readership. And then the other question was, how many are anthropologists? That we really have no way of tracking. So we're not sure, but I think I would say probably quite a bit are non-anthropologists.
Well, I don't know if there are 100,000 anthropologists in the world, so
yeah.
But the other question about social media is, do you allow, what do you call it, like, comments? Because I found that comments can be extremely, just in general, destructive. I did a column for the op-ed for the Washington Post. I got so much hate mail, I had to just stop reading it. And I was just wondering if you will allow, a lot of places are not allowing comments anymore. And I was wondering if you do, what's your policy?
We don't allow them on our site, but we have on social media, there are sometimes comments. So people will respond to the articles on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, but not on the actual site. It's mostly just a like logistical issue that it's too much work to kind of patrol those comments and vet them, because we don't want, to devolve into some kind of
No, it's a very wise decision. I mean, I've done research on media effects and anonymous media, when there's no patrolling, gets really a lot of negativity, including racism.
Yeah, for sure.
I advise never reading comments.
Yeah. After I read the first couple, my son said, stop reading, and I did.
Anyone else have a question? Louise. Oh, yeah, there you go.
I'm sort of in Patricia's position of being, done a lot of anthropology and done a lot of stuff. And, but I find that when I'm trying to do slightly different kind of writing, I've got just Zippo vocabulary that's descriptive and, lively and just, I was just writing a book of, a review of Elizabeth Pulvinelli's graphic memoir, and I just couldn't get like really good ways of describing stuff. And that's I think from years of writing, writing a lot of ethnographic prose, but also leaning a lot in my work on quotes from my informants and stuff, because that's what really usually I can get that has really interesting stuff in it. So except for maybe reading fiction and stuff, have you got any ideas about how to be able to write these sentences that are descriptive and bring the reader in, and the sort of stuff we were talking about?
If I could, in the courses that I've done, one of the first things I say to the participants is, you're all writers, right? And so what does that mean? It means that we present we take risks, we try things, we experiment, we read, we present those to other people, and they respond to them. And by the end of one of these workshops or courses, we've become a kind of, writers are very collaborative, generally, in my experience. And it creates a kind of community. And through that creation, people feel, the license to experiment and come up with new ways of doing things.
One of my favorite pieces of writing advice comes from William J. Strunk, book, which is omit needless words. That sounds like you're taking out everything, you kind of are. If you go into a sentence and the question is, do you need this word? Can you take 4 words and make them 2 words? You're better off. And then if you can add 1, but not 5 adjectives.
I just have a book recommendation. This book, Alive in the Writing by Kiran Narayan.
Really?
It's a really great book, and she gives like really concrete prompts throughout the book to really help you write in different ways. And I just think it's a really fun one to go through and helpful.
And who published that, Emily?
University of Chicago Press, I believe.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah, Karen's an SAR alumnus, and she writes beautifully. She's a lot of fun.
Right. Yeah. No.
Thinking about Tanya's comment, one of the things that drives me crazy about academic prose is we write in lists. So you never say the sky was blue, you say the sky was blue. I don't know, a lot of it is backside covering. It's like you want to show that you're aware that there are all kinds of issues about whether the sky is really blue, and there might be different ways of looking at it, instead of just saying the sky is blue and moving on. And I often find myself just crossing out. It's the same thing. Just say it once, and put down a position on it. I had some good advice years ago from Kai Erikson, who was the editor of the Yale Review and probably the best writer in sociology of his generation. And he was reading a manuscript of mine, actually the book about channeling. And it was at the heyday of where the anthropologist wanted to put herself into the text. Reflexive anthropology, and he just said there's too much first person singular in there, and it's not like your 5th grade teacher said you can't begin a sentence with I. It was more like, you don't need to say that you think that or you felt that, you just say it. The reader knows that you're feeling and you're thinking, and that's your opinion and you believe. And oddly enough, I found that just deleting all that made the book more intimate and more personal, and it's sort of paradoxical. And there are writers, actually, Philippe Descola's work from the Amazon, his in Sorcery, sorry, not in Sorcery Shadow, that's Paul's book, but The Spears of Twilight, which is a beautiful, very personal ethnography and a popular book that got a big Times review and reviews in Europe in the French edition. He doesn't really talk about himself all that much, and you really come away with a very strong sense of who the narrator is and what his perspective is. It was very powerful in that way, and I learned a lot from it.
Michael, I think Carla has a question.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Hi, Carla.
Hey, hi, how are you? Thanks. This has been great. I'm sorry I arrived late, and actually I hope my questions aren't about things that were addressed before I joined the session. So apologies if that happens. I guess I'm interested in hearing from Paul and Tanya about whether there was a transition in the way you write, in your style of writing, in the more narrative crossover ways of your writing, or if you always, as anthropologists, were writing this way. I feel like I'm somebody who's trying to undo the writing that I was trained in. And, I have 2 books. The second book got a little bit closer, but still not where I'd like it to be. I don't know if I have a 3rd book in me, but I am just interested to see if there's a progression or a transition that happens, or if you need to really start from the beginning.
Well, for me, I was doing journalism before I did anthropology, so I had a little bit of that. I also wrote before I became an anthropologist. I wrote fiction. It was very bad fiction, but it was fiction nonetheless. I came back to fiction after a while, after 25 years later. So I've always liked storytelling. Has always been a fundamental aspect of the way I approach interpersonal relations and the way I approach my writing. I found that when I started blogging in 2010, I found that blogging made my academic writing, my narrative writing better, because I was forced to be concise, be clear, be economical in my prose. And so it sort of really honed in my capacity to tell stories in prose. And also teaching writing is also, I think, has been an influence in terms of transitioning as well. So those kinds of things. But I've always, from the get-go, I've always wanted to tell stories and try to do that as best I could.
I would echo that. I mean, I have this kind of entered the field with this real political commitment that it was important not to write to to try to tell people like my parents what I was doing, that mattered. And my father has actually been really my best audience for all my writing time. He's actually become a better audience as his memory has gotten less good, paradoxically, because he's better at reading repeated drafts. And what I want to know from him is which paragraphs are boring. Where does his attention begin to fade? That's the most important thing I want to know from him. But I really believe that writing is a skill that you can acquire. I don't think the process ever gets easier, but I think the sentences get better. Yeah. And I think, E.B. White once said that if anyone could do anything else, they would not become a writer because it's just so much work. And I think there's something to that. But it's just, you just hone your sense of what sounds good.
Yeah. Perhaps we should end on that note. I just want to say hi to Karla, who I've never met, but if I'm not mistaken, you were an SAR scholar a couple of years before I landed here. It's great to see you. I hope to meet you in person. It's nice to see Miriam Kolar again, who's here fairly recently, and I'm probably missing some other former scholars who I didn't know because they were not in my time here. But thank you all for joining us. If you
I think we lost Michael.
Yeah.
Michael, come back. I'll jump in. I think what he was going to say is if you have ideas for other programs or you're interested in being more involved, as we develop ways to engage the alumni community, or you have people who are in your cohort that you feel like, you know, they haven't been engaged, but you'd like them to be, please like reach out to myself or Michael or Sarah or Paul Ryer, who's on this call. And we would love to stay connected and keep you all in the loop and keep providing value. I think what was so delightful from today's program was hearing pieces that are really applicable to almost every stage of the careers of the folks who are represented in this room. So, and I'm so happy that we did this as a traditional Zoom and not as a Zoom webinar where we couldn't see each other, didn't have the opportunity to kind of unmute in certain instances. So hopefully we'll be doing similar things in the future. And Paul, Tanya, Emily, thank you for your wisdom. And I think Michael's popping back on, so maybe we'll give him a minute to try to say goodbyes. And we will send out a recording of today's session if you did pop in a little late. So be on the lookout for that tomorrow. I probably won't get to it until tomorrow afternoon, but I'll be circulating that to everyone who registered. And you're welcome to share that as well. It's not something that is like behind a paywall or something like that. So keep that in mind also. Michael, did you want to say a last word since you're back?
Yeah, I mean, my power just went out. The whole screen, I had to reboot, and I don't know what's going on. It must have been a micro outage of some sort. Anyway, thanks for joining us. It was really great. And we'd like to do more of this. So I'm sure, as Meredith said, if you'd like to hear more, let us know, because well, first of all, it's a blast to do. And it's nice to see those of you who haven't seen in a long time, and nice to meet new people. So by all means, we welcome the feedback, and we'll keep doing this.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to end the session. So we'll see everyone soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.